Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. And this is The Unworthy One, The Master of the Jade Pavilion by Manly P. Hall, an article taken from Horizon, the Magazine of Useful and Intelligent Living, Volume 18, Number 1, Summer 1958. The Unworthy One, The Master of the Jade Pavilion. I found a neatly folded note from Mr. Nakamura tucked under the door of my room when I returned late one afternoon to my hotel. It was an invitation to join him at his shop that evening about 7:30, provided, of course, that I had nothing more important to do and could find some pleasure in his humble company. Needless to say, my rickshaw was at his door at the exact time he had specified. Evidently, Mr. Nakamura had been watching through the window of his store, for he came out before I could dismiss my conveyance. Motioning the rickshaw boy to wait, he shook my hand warmly. "So happy, Haru-san," he murmured, climbing in beside me. "Perhaps you will find this little adventure amusing." After careful instructions to the boy, who started off at a jogging trot, Mr. Nakamura, his face wreathed in smiles, remarked softly, "I hope you are very well, and do not lean back too far, or this crazy thing will tip over, and you will not be so well." After a most confusing trip and several near collisions with other vehicles, we arrived at an impressive building with wide roofs of green tile, from the corners of which hung ancient bronze wind bells. As we climbed the broad flight of shallow stone steps, Mr. Nakamura paused for a moment to give me special instructions. "You are about to meet a most curious person, and no matter what happens, do not appear surprised. Everything that occurs will be according to a long-established pattern, and later, over a cup of tea, we will discuss the details." My friend then led the way into a spacious hall, its carved and painted ceiling supported by red and black lacquered columns. A door at the left stood open, and I was ushered into a splendidly furnished apartment. It gave the impression of being a museum. There were several long tables of carved and polished teakwood, and on these a variety of precious articles were tastefully displayed. The collection was obviously Chinese, and most of the curios appeared to be of great age. Dancers and musicians modeled in clay still showed traces of original coloring. Mythological monsters glistened with the luster of green and yellow glaze. There were burial urns, beautiful examples of early celadon, fragments of exquisite frescoes inlaid into teakwood frames, Buddhistic figures in stone broken from the walls of caves, marble heads of divinities, and a wealth of other material. It was indeed a splendid collection. At the far end of the room, seated on a massive throne-like chair, was an elderly man resembling a portly Buddha. He was completely bald. His skin was the color of ancient parchment, and the whites of his bright, piercing eyes had the tone of old amber due to long use of opium. He wore a black brocaded Chinese coat with a standing collar, and his arms, crossed on his ample front, appeared to be without hands because these were tucked into his exaggerated sleeves. The costume was completed by a pair of black and white leather American sport shoes. Mr. Nakamura led the way. Stopping a few feet from the august-looking individual, he bowed profoundly, and I followed his example. Mr. Nakamura spoke in Chinese, and after appropriate felicitations, introduced me to the master of the Jade Pavilion. There was further conversation, explaining my presence, no doubt, for the sharp eyes of the Ancient One were upon me. Evidently, Mr. Nakamura's words were acceptable, for a faint trace of a smile was bestowed in my direction. In due time, the proper pleasantries were concluded, and my friendly shopkeeper escorted me to a chair, motioned me to sit down, and then returned to the rotund old man. Slowly, the extraordinary figure, huddled in his black robe, unfolded his arms, and two long, slender hands with beautifully tapering fingers came into view. One hand held a short wooden hammer, its head bound with rings of bronze. Mr. Nakamura, again bowing, stepped closer, and the hammer was passed to him. Holding it firmly, he walked to the center of the room and, slowly turning, noted swiftly but accurately the display of Chinese art. He then approached the first table, giving his entire attention to a tall funereal vase in pale blue glaze that looked as though it had been excavated from a Tang tomb. After several minutes, he suddenly struck the vase with the bronze-bound hammer, breaking it into a dozen pieces. It was a distinct shock to see the beautiful object so ruthlessly destroyed. I glanced toward the master of the Jade Pavilion and was amazed to see him smiling broadly. Mr. Nakamura slowly walked the length of the table, demolishing piece after piece until more than half of the bowls and figurines had been reduced to fragments. He then proceeded to all the other tables in turn, leaving a trail of wreckage behind him. It seemed to me that less than a third of the collection remained when he had finished. After pausing for a last brief survey, he walked back to the master of the Jade Pavilion and with a low bow returned the hammer. By this time, the portly old man was literally shaking with laughter. He nodded his head, gesticulated excitedly, and talked Chinese with a high, sibilant voice. At last, it seemed his emotions could no longer be restrained. He rose, stepped forward, and embraced Mr. Nakamura. Finally, both men shook hands, and it was evident that they were about to part on the best of terms. The air was so bright with cheer that the master of the Jade Pavilion even shook hands with me, patted my shoulder, and personally escorted us both to the door. As we left the building, it was obvious that Mr. Nakamura was in excellent spirits and most eager to return to the privacy of his shop. He could see my bewilderment, and this no doubt added to his delight. He did not speak, however, except to say that the weather was exceedingly pleasant and the traffic exceptionally heavy. Back in his store, he remained non-committal until the tea was properly hot and the rice cakes artistically spread on an antique plate. Then, in an appropriate atmosphere of comfort and leisure, he told the story of the master of the Jade Pavilion. For many years, a curious establishment had flourished in a suburb of Peking. It was called the Jade Pavilion. It existed for one purpose only: to produce priceless works of Oriental art in the form of fabrications and counterfeits. Mr. Nakamura hastened to point out that the workmen were a skilled and consecrated group of master craftsmen with almost unbelievable knowledge of ancient wares and traditions. On occasion, they had departed from their usual policy and had produced some excellent Egyptian mummies, and had even copied successfully the golden vessels from an ancient Byzantine church. Nothing was beyond them, and if no model was available, they improvised with consummate ingenuity. They never compromised their talents, however, by entering into mass production. Each example of their genius was entirely different from any other, a masterpiece in its own right. From the Jade Pavilion, a thin stream of reasonable facsimiles trickled through the antique trade into great private collections, and finally reached some of the best museums in Europe and America. So expertly were these replicas conceived and executed that they would pass almost any test to which they could be subjected. The present master of the Jade Pavilion was no ordinary mortal, but a scholar, a scientist, and a philosopher of good parts. He did not lead a double life, for his accomplishments were well known, but he was respected throughout the area, and before the revolution had enjoyed the personal friendship of the young Manchu emperor. Although his title was entirely honorary, it was a distinction generally accepted. In due time, after he had departed from this world, he would become a myth, and men would mention his name with awe and admiration. Each year, the master of the Jade Pavilion made a special trip to Japan with the choicest of his wares, in order that he could present his products to Mr. Nakamura for criticism or approval. The little shopkeeper had so large a reputation for his knowledge of ancient art that all the more important pieces had to pass his inspection. It was all a strange business, but Mr. Nakamura relished it keenly because it was also, in a way, extremely hazardous. When the various fabricated antiques were arranged for his inspection, genuine items were included among them. Mr. Nakamura was privileged to destroy anything and everything which he considered fraudulent. If, however, by any chance he destroyed a genuine piece, he was required to pay the price of its worth, usually a very large sum. Depending entirely upon his intuitive knowledge, Mr. Nakamura played a game which could be most expensive if he made a mistake. One of the reasons why the master of the Jade Pavilion had been in a jovial mood was that several of his most superb counterfeits had passed the test. Mr. Nakamura had not felt entirely certain, and so had allowed them to remain intact. Each year, I was told, a few more were spared, which indicated that the quality of the workmanship was constantly improving. How is it possible, I inquired, to explain satisfactorily the constant appearance of these new originals on the art market? The shopkeeper assured me that this presented little difficulty. Appropriate documentation and a skillful situation were contrived so that each new find seemed entirely plausible. An old burial mound was genuinely discovered, but by the time its treasures reached the market, they had multiplied sevenfold. After we had discussed this phase of the subject for several minutes, Mr. Nakamura suddenly directed a sharp question toward me. "Did you notice anything else peculiar?" After a moment's hesitation, I shook my head. "Then you missed the most remarkable counterfeit of them all," he observed wryly. When he saw that I did not follow his thinking, he explained, "The master of the Jade Pavilion is also an elaborate fabrication, but this is strictly between ourselves. In the first place, he is not even Chinese, and his story is likewise, shall I say, amusing. This strange man was born in Belfast, Ireland, more than 70 years ago. Even then, he had a strange look about him and did not resemble the other members of his family. Before he was 20 years of age, he went to sea, and the ship on which he sailed docked at Hong Kong. The moment he reached China, something happened to him. As he has told me, it seemed as though he had found his real home. He stayed in the Orient, found work in Canton with an English exporting house, and in a very short time mastered the Chinese language, which he speaks without an accent. He then moved further inland, put on Chinese dress, and was accepted by the people as one of themselves. He gained distinction as a scholar and a poet, and when the time came to make a new issue of the great Chinese Encyclopedia of Ancient Arts, he was personally selected by the emperor to edit the massive work, which appeared in more than 100 volumes. In the course of time, he became associated with the Jade Pavilion as an expert on Chinese art and culture. On his deathbed, the previous proprietor chose this Irishman to be his successor and entrusted to him all the delicate machinery of an extremely intricate business. He has carried it on most successfully. Today, he has almost forgotten his foreign birth. He will not speak English at all, nor will he associate with non-Orientals. He married a Chinese woman of high station and is training his eldest son to succeed him in his profession. Also, he seems to live not in this time, but in those ancient periods when the great art of the Han, the Wei, the Tang, and the Sung was produced. He appears to possess the spirit of the ancient masters who fashioned these beautiful works of art. Although it may not appear to us to be entirely satisfactory, he has his own code of ethics. He does not view his productions as common copies. Rather, he likes to think of himself as an ancient artisan born in another time and fully qualified to carry on the classical tradition. I have known him for many years and have become fond of him, although he is unfathomable. As a Buddhist, it has occurred to me that in him some great artist of the Tang dynasty has found rebirth. Yes, indeed, Haru-san, I find the master of the Jade Pavilion most stimulating, but needless to say, the shop of K. Nakamura is in every way highly reputable. I would not think of passing off any of his creations upon my customers, although it is possible that I have done so without my knowledge. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.